Ostman picked out individuals, known as non-shooters, and pressured them to kill, sometimes successfully. But as a general rule, even putative duress does not hold for Reserve Police Battalion 101. From the time Major Trapp, with choked voice and tears streaming down his cheeks, offered to excuse those not up to it at J6ZEF 6W and protected the first man vertical bar, to take up his offer, from Captain Hoffman's wrath, a situation of JJ putative duress did not exist in the battalion. Trapp's subsequent behavior, not just excusing Lieutenant Buchman from party passion in Jewish actions, but clearly protecting a man who made vertical bar no secret of his disapproval, only made matters clearer. A set of unwritten ground rules emerged within the battalion. For small shooting actions, volunteers were requested, or shooters were chosen, from among those who were known to be willing to kill or who simply did not make the effort to keep their distance when firing squads were being formed. For large actions, those who would not kill were not compelled. Even officers' attempts to force individual non-shooters to kill could be refused, for the vertical bar men knew that the officers could not appeal to Major Trapp. Vertical bar everyone but the most open critics, like Buchman, did have vertical bar to participate in cordon duty and roundups, but in such circumstances individuals could still make their own decisions about shooting. The testimonies are filled with stories of men who disobeyed standing orders during the ghetto clearing operations, and did not shoot infants, or those attempting to hide or escape. Even men who admitted to having taken part in firing squads claimed not to have shot in the confusion and melee of the ghetto clearings, or out on patrol, when their behavior could not be closely observed. If obedience to orders, out of fear of dire punishment, is not a valid explanation, what about obedience to authority, in the more general sense used by Stanley Milgram? Deference, simply as a product of socialization and evolution, a deeply ingrained behavior tendency to comply with the directives of those positioned hierarchically above, even to the point of performing repugnant actions in violation of universally accepted moral norms. In a series of now famous experiments, Milgram tested the individual's ability to resist authority that was not backed by any external coercive threat. Naive volunteer subjects were instructed by a scientific authority in an alleged learning experiment to inflict an escalating series of fake electric shocks upon an actor/victim who responded with carefully programmed voice feedback, an escalating series of complaints, cries of pain, calls for help, and finally fateful silence. In the standard voice feedback experiment, 2/3 of Milgram's subjects were obedient to the point of inflicting extreme pain. 21 several variations on the experiment produced significantly different results. If the actor/victim was shielded so that the subject could hear and see no response, obedience was much greater. If the subject had both visual and voice feedback, compliance to the extreme fell to 40%. If the subject had to touch the actor/victim physically by forcing his hand onto an electric plate to deliver the shocks, obedience dropped to 30%. If a non-authority figure gave orders, obedience was nil. If the naive subject performed a subsidiary or accessory task, but did not personally inflict the electric shocks, obedience was nearly total. In contrast, if the subject was part of an actor/peer group that staged a carefully planned refusal to continue following the directions of the authority figure, the vast majority of subjects, 90%, joined their peer group and desisted as well. If the subject was given complete discretion as to the level of electric shock to administer, all but a few sadists consistently delivered a minimal shock. When not under the direct surveillance of the scientist, many of the subjects cheated by giving lower shocks than prescribed, even though they were unable to confront authority and abandon the experiment. 22 Milgram adduced a number of factors to account for such an unexpectedly high degree of potentially murderous obedience to a non-coercive authority. An evolutionary bias favors the survival of people who can adapt to hierarchical situations and organized social activity. Socialization through family, school, and military service, as well as a whole array of rewards and punishments within society, generally reinforces and internalizes a tendency toward obedience. A seemingly voluntary entry into an authority system perceived as legitimate creates a strong sense of obligation. Those within the hierarchy adopt the authority's perspective or definition of the situation, in this case, as an important scientific experiment rather than the infliction of physical torture. The notions of loyalty, duty, discipline requiring competent performance, in the eyes of authority, become moral imperatives overriding any identification with the victim. Normal individuals enter an agentic state in which they are the instrument of another's will. In such a state, they no longer feel personally responsible for the content of their actions, but only for how well they perform. 23. Once entangled, people encounter a series of binding factors, or cementing mechanisms, that make disobedience, or refusal even more difficult. The momentum of the process discourages any new or contrary initiative. The situational obligation, or etiquette, makes refusal appear improper, rude, or even an immoral breach of obligation. And a socialized anxiety over potential punishment for disobedience acts as a further deterrent. 24. Milgram made direct reference to the similarities between human behavior in his experiments and under the Nazi regime. He concluded men are led to kill with little difficulty. 25. Milgram was aware of significant differences in the two situations, however. Quite explicitly, he acknowledged that the subjects of his experiments were assured that no permanent physical damage would result from their actions. The subjects were under no threat or duress themselves. And finally, the actor/victims were not the object of intense devaluation through systematic indoctrination of the subjects. In contrast, the killers of the Third Reich lived in a police state where the consequences of disobedience could be drastic, and they were subjected to intense indoctrination, but they also knew they were not only inflicting pain, but destroying human life. 26 was the massacre at J6ZEFOW, a land of radical Milgram experiment that took place in a Polish forest with real killers and victims rather than in a social psychology laboratory with naive subjects and actor/victims, are the actions of Reserve Police Battalion 101, explained by Milgram's observations and conclusions. There are some difficulties in explaining Defoe as a case of deference to authority, for none of Milgram's experimental variations exactly paralleled the historical situation at J6ZEF6W, and the relevant differences constitute too many variables to draw firm conclusions in any scientific sense. Nonetheless, many of Milgram's insights find graphic confirmation in the behavior and testimony of the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101. At J6ZEF6W, the authority system to which the men were responding was quite complex, unlike the laboratory situation. Major Trapp represented not a strong, but a very weak authority figure. He weepingly conceded the frightful nature of the task at hand and invited the older reserve policemen to excuse themselves. If Trapp was a weak immediate authority figure, he did invoke a more distant system of authority that was anything but weak. The orders for the massacre had been received from the highest quarter, he said. Trapp himself and the battalion, as a unit, were bound by the orders of this distant authority, even if Trapp's concern for his men exempted individual policemen. To what were the vast majority of Trapp's men responding when they did not step out? Was it to authority as represented either by Trapp or his superiors? Were they responding to Trapp not primarily as an authority figure, but as an individual, a popular and beloved officer, whom they would not leave in the lurch? And what about other factors? Milgram himself notes that people far more frequently invoke authority than conformity to explain their behavior, for only the former seems to absolve them of personal responsibility. Subjects deny conformity and embrace obedience as the explanation of their actions. 27 Yet many policemen admitted responding to the pressures of conformity. How would they be seen in the eyes of their comrades? Not authority. On Milgram's own view, such admission was the tip of the iceberg, and this factor must have been even more important than the men conceded in their testimony. So, conformity assumes a more central role than authority. At Milgram tested the effects of peer pressure in bolstering the individual's capacity to resist authority. When actor/collaborators bolted, the naive subjects found it much easier to follow. Milgram also attempted to test for the reverse, that is, the role FGF conformity, in intensifying the capacity to inflict pain. 28 3 objects, 2 collaborators and 1 naive, were instructed by the scientist/authority figure to inflict pain at the lowest level anyone among them proposed. When a naive subject acting alone had been given full discretion to set the level of electric shock, the object had almost invariably inflicted minimal pain. But when 2 collaborators, always going first, proposed a step-by-step escalation of electric shock, the naive subject was significantly influenced. Though the individual variation was wide, the average result was the selection of a level of electric shock, halfway between no increase and a consistent step-by-step increase. This is still short of a test of peer pressure, as compensation for the deficiencies of weak authority. There was no weeping but beloved scientist inviting subjects to leave the care at electric shock panel, while other men, with whom the subjects had comradely relations, and before whom they would feel compelled to appear manly and tough, stayed and continued to inflict painful shocks. Indeed, it would be almost impossible to construct an experiment to test such a scenario, which would require true comradely relations between a naive subject and the actor/collaborators. Nonetheless, the mutual reinforcement of authority and conformity seems to have been clearly demonstrated by Milgram. If the multifaceted nature of authority at J6ZEF6W and the key role of conformity among the policemen are not quite parallel to Milgram's experiments, they nonetheless render considerable support to his conclusions, and some of his observations are clearly confirmed. Direct proximity to the horror of the killing significantly increased the number of men who would no longer comply. On the other hand, with the division of labor and removal of the killing process to the death camps, the men felt scarcely any responsibility at all for their actions. As in Milgram's experiment, without direct surveillance, many policemen did not comply with orders when not directly supervised. They mitigated their behavior when they could do so without personal risk, but were unable to refuse participation in the battalion's killing operations openly. One factor that admittedly was not the focal point of Milgram's experiments, indoctrination, and another that was only partially touched upon, conformity, require further investigation. Milgram did stipulate definition of the situation, or ideology, that which gives meaning and coherence to the social occasion, as a crucial antecedent of deference to authority. Controlling the manner in which people interpret their world is one way to control behavior, Milgram argues. If they accept authority's ideology, action follows logically and willingly. Hence, ideological justification is vital in obtaining willing obedience, for it permits the person to see his behavior as serving a desirable end. 29 In Milgram's experiments, overarching ideological justification was present in the form of a tacit and unquestioned faith in the goodness of science and its contribution to progress. But there was no systematic attempt to devalue the actor/victim or inculcate the subject with a particular ideology. Milgram hypothesized that the more destructive behavior of people in Nazi Germany, under much less direct surveillance, was a consequence of an internalization of authority, achieved through relatively long processes of indoctrination, of a sort not possible within the course of a laboratory hour. 30 To what degree, then, did the conscious inculcation of Nazi doctrines shape the behavior of the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101? Were they subjected to such a barrage of clever and insidious propaganda that they lost the capacity for independent thought and responsible action? Were devaluation of the Jews and exhortations to kill them central to this indoctrination? A popular term for intense indoctrination and psychological manipulation, emerging from the Korean War experience of captured American soldiers, is brainwashing. Were these killers in some general sense brainwashed? Unquestionably, Himmler set a premium on the ideological indoctrination of members of the SS and the police. They were to be not just efficient soldiers and policemen but ideologically motivated warriors, crusaders against the political and racial enemies of the Third Reich. 31 Indoctrination efforts embraced not only the elite organizations of the SS but also the Order V police, extending even to the lowly reserve police, though the Reservists scarcely fit Himmler's notion of the new Nazi racial aristocracy. For instance, membership in the SS required proof greater than of ancestry untainted by Jewish blood through 5 generations. In contrast, even first-degree Mischlinge, people with 2 Jewish grandparents, and their spouses were not banned from vertical barge service in the reserve police until October 1942. Second-degree Mischlinge, 1 Jewish grandparent, and their spouses were banned until April 1943. 32. In its guidelines for basic training of January 23, 1940, the Murder Police Main Office decreed that in addition to physical fitness, use of weapons, and police techniques, all order police battalions were to be strengthened in character and ideology. 33. Basic training included a 1-month unit on ideological education. One topic for the first week was race as the basis of our worldview, followed the second week by maintaining the purity of blood. 34. Beyond basic training, the police battalions, JWTH active and reserve, were to receive continued military and ideological training from their officers. 35 officers were required to attend 1-week workshops that included 1 hour of ideological instruction for themselves, and 1 hour of practice in the ideological instruction of others. 36. A 5-part study plan of January 1941 included the subsections Understanding of Race 9 and the basis of our worldview, the Jewish question, in Germany, and maintaining the purity of German blood. 37. Explicit instructions were issued on the spirit and frequency of this continuing ideological training, for which the National Socialist worldview was to be the plumb line. Every day, or at least every other day, the men were to be informed about current events and their proper understanding in ideological perspective. Every week officers were to hold 30 to 45-minute sessions, in which they delivered a short lecture, or read an edifying excerpt from suggested books or specially prepared SS pamphlets. The officers were to choose some theme: loyalty, comradeship, the offensive spirit, through which the educational goals of National Socialism could be clearly expressed. Monthly sessions were to be held on the most important themes of the time, and could feature officers and educational personnel of the SS and Party. 38. The officers of Reserve Police Battalion 101 obviously complied with these directives on ideological education. In December 1942, Captains Hoffman and Wolof and Lieutenant Nade were recognized for their activities in the area of ideological training and care for the troops. They were each awarded a book to be presented by their commanding officer. 39. Himmler's undoubted intentions aside, however, a look at the actual materials used to indoctrinate Reserve Police Battalion 101 raises serious doubts about the adequacy of SS indoctrination as an explanation for the men becoming killers. 2 Lands of Order Police educational materials are preserved in the German Federal Archives Bundesarchiv in Koblenz. The first are 2 series of weekly circulars, issued by the Department for Ideological Education of the Order Police between 1940 and 1944. 40. A few of the lead articles were written by such Nazi luminaries and noted ideological firebrands as Joseph Goebbels, Alfred Rosenberg, Hitler's minister for occupied Russia, and Walter Gross, the head of the party's Office of Racial Politics. The general racist perspective was of course pervasive. Nonetheless, in some 200 issues altogether, relatively little space was devoted explicitly to anti-Semitism and the Jewish question. 1 issue, Jewry and Criminality, exceptionally ponderous even by the quite undistinguished standards of the series, concluded that alleged Jewish characteristics, such immoderateness, vanity, curiosity, the denial of real soullessness, stupidity, malice, and brutality, were exact characteristics of the perfect criminal. 4L such prose have put readers to sleep. It certainly did not turn them into errs. The only other article, devoted entirely to the Jewish question, the back page, in December 1941, was entitled A Goal of This Europe Free of Jews. It noted ominously that the fear that a new war instigated by the Jews would not about the collapse of anti-Semitic Germany, but on the contrary, the end of the Jews was now being carried out. The native solution of the Jewish problem, that is, not only ridding them of power but actually removing this parasitical from the family of European peoples, was imminent. What appeared impossible 2 years ago was now becoming reality step by step. At the end of this war, there would exist a greater than free of Jews. 42. Recalling Hitler's prophecy and invoking his authority in Mektion, with the ultimate goal of a Europe free of Jews, was of course peculiar to SS indoctrination materials. On the contrary, the same message was widely circulated to the general public. How little these materials were directed at brainwash the reserve police into becoming mass murderers, more can be seen from another article of September 20, 1942, a single item in the entire 2 series devoted to the reserve. Lice. Far from stealing them to be superhumanly inhuman to accomplish great tasks, the article assumed that the reserves were doing nothing of noticeable importance. To boost your morale, presumably threatened above all by boredom, either reservists were assured that no matter how innocuous their jobs might seem, in total war everyone is important. 43. By FS time, the older reservists of Reserve Police Battalion 101 carried out the mass shootings at J6ZEFTW and Lomazi and initial deportations from Perchu and Mijierzik. They on the eve of a climactic and murderous 6-week assault on the ghettos of northern Lublin. It is unlikely any of them would have found this article terribly relevant, much less inspiring. A series of special pamphlets 4 to 6 a year for the ideological education of the order police constituted a second group of indoctrination materials. In 1941, one issue covered the blood community of the German peoples and the Great German Empire. 44. In 1942, there was an issue entitled Germany Reorganizes Europe, and a special issue called SS Man and the Question of Blood. 45. A large combined issue in 1943 was devoted to the politics of race. 46. Beginning with the 1942 special issue on the question of blood, but above all in the 1943 issue the politics of race, the treatment of racial doctrine, and the Jewish question, became very thorough and systematic. The German people, Volk, or blood community, Blutsgemeinschaft, was comprised of a mixture of 6 closely related European races, the largest 50 to 60% being the Nordic race. Shaped by a severe northern climate that ruthlessly eliminated weak elements, the Nordic race was superior to any other in the world, as could be seen from German cultural and military achievements. The German Volk faced a constant struggle for survival ordained by nature, according to whose laws all weak and inferior are destroyed, and only the strong and powerful continue to propagate. To win this struggle, the Volk needed to do 2 things. Conquer living space to provide for further population growth and preserve the purity of German blood. The fate of peoples who did not expand their numbers or preserve their racial purity could be seen in the examples of Sparta and Rome. The main threat to a healthy awareness of the need for territorial expansion and racial purity came from doctrines propagating the essential equality of mankind. The first such doctrine was Christianity, spread by the Jew Paul. The second was liberalism, emerging from the French Revolution, the uprising of the racially inferior, instigated by the Jew-ridden Freemasons. The third and greatest threat was Marxism/Bolshevism, authored by the Jew Karl Marx. The Jews are a racial mixture, which in contrast to all other pies and races, preserves its essential character first of all its parasitical instinct. With no regard for either instancy or logic, the pamphlet then asserted that the Jew kept his own race pure, while striking at the existence of his host. Through race mixing, no coexistence was possible between conscious people and the Jews, only a struggle that would win when the last Jew had left our part of the earth. The End War was just such a struggle, one that would decide the of Europe. With the destruction of the Jews, the last T of European collapse would be removed. For what explicit purpose were these pamphlets written? T. Conclusions. Did this review of the basic tenets of nationalist race thinking urge upon the reader? Neither the question of blood nor the politics of race ended with a call eliminate the racial enemy. Rather, they concluded with rotations to give birth to more Germans. The racial battle was part a demographic battle determined by the laws of fertility, selection. War was counter-selection in pure form, for only did the best fall on the field of battle, but they did so having children. The victory of arms required a victory children. As the SS represented a selection of predominantly Ach elements within the German people, SS men had ambition to marry early, choose young, racially pure, and fertile for us, and have large numbers of children. Number of factors must be kept in mind, therefore, in aiding the indoctrination of the reserve police through flits such as these. First, the most detailed and thorough flit was not even issued until 1943, after the Northern Blind Security Zone of Reserve Police Battalion 101 was virtually of Jews. It appeared too late to have played a role in training this battalion for mass murder. Second, the 1942 flit was clearly directed at the family obligations of the young SS man, and particularly irrelevant to middle-aged reserve, who had long ago made their decisions about marriage and size of family. Thus, even though available, it would have seemed singularly inappropriate as the basis for one of TH Battalion's weekly or monthly indoctrination sessions. Third, the age of the men affected their susceptibility to indoctrination in another way as well. Many of the Nazi perpetrators were very young men. They had been raised in a world in which Nazi values were the only moral norms they knew. Could be argued that such young men, schooled and formed solely under the conditions of the Nazi dictatorship, simply do not know any better. Killing Jews did not conflict with the value system they had grown up with, and hence indoctrination was much easier. Whatever the merits of such an argument, it clearly does not hold for the predominantly middle-aged men of Reserve Police Battalion 101. They were educated and spent their formative years in the pre-1933 period. Many came from a socialist milieu that was relatively unreceptive to National Socialism. They knew perfectly well the moral norms of German society before the Nazis. They had earlier standards by which to judge the Nazi policies they were asked to carry out. Fourth, ideological tracks, like those prepared for the Ord police, certainly reflected the wider ambience within which TH reserve policemen were trained and instructed, as well as TH political culture, in which they had lived for the previous decade. As Lieutenant Drucker said with extraordinary understatement, under the influence of the times, my attitude to the Jews was marked by a certain aversion. The denigration of Jews and TH proclamation of Germanic racial superiority was so constant, as pervasive, so relentless, that it must have shaped the genuine attitudes of masses of people in Germany, including the Avrag reserve policemen. Fifth and last, the pamphlets and materials that dealt with TH Jews justified the necessity of a Juden for Europe, seeking support and sympathy for such a goal, but they did not explicit urge personal participation in achieving that goal through killing Jews. This point is worth mentioning, because some of the Ord police instructional guidelines concerning partisan warfare state plainly that each individual must be tough enough to kill Tysons, and more important, suspects. The partisan struggle is a struggle for Bolshevism, it is not a people's movement. The enemy must be totally destroyed. The incessant decision over life and death posed by the partisans and suspects is difficult even for the toughest soldier. But it must be done. He behaves correctly who, by setting aside all possible impulses of personal feeling, proceeds ruthlessly and mercilessly. 47 All the surviving indoctrination materials of the Order Police is no parallel set of guidelines that attempts to prepare Jin and to kill unarmed Jewish women and children. Certainly large numbers of Jews were murdered in the framework linked suspects during anti-partisan sweeps in the Polish territories garrisoned by Reserve Police Battalion 101 in 1942. There simply was no major overlap between killing suspects and killing Jews. For this unit, at least, the ig of Jews cannot be explained by brutal exhortations to kill as and suspects. No other comparison is pertinent here. Before the Einsatzgruppen entered Soviet territory, they underwent a 2-month period. Their preparation included visits and speeches various SS luminaries, who gave them pep talks about the Ling War of Destruction. 4 days before the invasion, the SRS were recalled to Berlin for an intimate meeting with R.D. Heydrich himself. In short, considerable effort was to prepare these men for the mass murder they were going to perpetrate. Even the men of the police battalions that fed the Einsatzgruppen into Russia in the summer of 1941 partially prepared for what awaited them. They were led of the secret directive for the execution of captured Nazists, the Commissar order, and the guidelines for the Lent of the civilian population. Some battalion commanders also attempted to inspire their troops through speeches, did Dallowge and Himmler when visiting. In contrast, body officers and men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 were singularly unprepared for and surprised by the murderous task that awaited them. In summary, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101, like the rest of German society, were immersed in a deluge of racist and anti-Semitic propaganda. Furthermore, the order police provided for indoctrination both in basic training and as an ongoing practice within each unit. Such incessant propagandizing must have had a considerable effect in reinforcing general notions of Germanic racial superiority and a certain aversion toward the Jews. However, much of the indoctrination material was clearly not targeted at older reservists, and in some cases was highly inappropriate or irrelevant to them. And material specifically designed to harden the policemen for the personal task of killing Jews is conspicuously absent from the surviving documentation. One would have to be quite convinced of the manipulative powers of indoctrination to believe that any of this material could have deprived the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 of less than capacity for independent thought, influenced and conditioned in a general way, imbued in particular with a sense of their or superiority and racial kinship as well as Jewish inferiority and otherness. Many of them undoubtedly were explicitly preparing for the task of killing Jews. They most certainly were not. Along with ideological indoctrination, a vital factor to check upon but not fully explored in Milgram's experiments was conformity to the group. The battalion had orders to kill Jews, but each individual did not. Yet 80 to 90% of the men proceeded to kill, though almost all of them, at least initially, were horrified and disgusted by what they were doing. To break ranks and step out to adopt overtly nonconformist behavior was simply beyond most of the men. It was easier for them to shoot. Why? First of all, by breaking ranks, non-shooters were leaving the dirty work to their comrades. Since the battalion had to shoot even if individuals did not, refusing to shoot constituted one's share of an unpleasant collective obligation. It was and a social act vis-a-vis one's comrades. Those who did shoot risked isolation, rejection, and ostracism, a very uncomfortable prospect within the framework of a tight-knit unit greater than Ned, abroad among a hostile population, so that the individual had virtually nowhere else to turn for support and social. His threat of isolation was intensified by the fact that stepping could also have been seen as a form of moral reproach of one's raids. The non-shooter was potentially indicating that he was good to do such things. Most, though not all, non-shooters ideally tried to diffuse the criticism of their comrades that was rent in their actions. They pleaded not that they were too, but rather that they were too weak to kill. Such a stance presented no challenge to the esteem of one's raids. On the contrary, it legitimized and upheld toughness, superior quality. For the anxious individual, it had the advantage of posing no moral challenge to the murderousness of the regime, though it did pose another problem, since difference between being weak and being a coward was great. Hence the distinction made by one policeman who did dare to step out at J6ZEF6W for fear of being considered but who subsequently dropped out of his firing squad. It one thing to be too cowardly even to try to kill. It was after resolutely trying to do one's share, to be too weak to continue. 48 Idiously therefore, most of those who did not shoot only roomed the macho values of the majority. According to H, it was a positive quality to be tough enough to kill non-combatant men, women, and children, and tried to rupture the bonds of comradeship that constituted their world. Coping with the contradictions imposed by the ends of conscience on the one hand and the norms of the on the other led to many tortured attempts at not shooting infants on the spot but taking them to the bloody point, not shooting on patrol if no go-getter was along who might report such squeamishness, bringing Jews to the shooting site and firing but intentionally missing. Only the very exceptional remained indifferent to taunts of weakling from their comrades, and could live with the fact that they were considered to be no man. 49. Here we come full circle to the mutually intensifying effects of war and racism noted by John Jarr, in conjunction with the insidious effects of constant propaganda and indoctrination. Pervasive racism and the resulting exclusion of the Jewish victims from any common ground with the perpetrators made it all the easier for the majority of the policemen to conform to the norms of their immediate community, the battalion, and their society at large. Nazi Germany. Here the years of anti-Semitic propaganda and prior to the Nazi dictatorship, decades of shrill German nationalism, dovetailed with the polarizing effects of war. The dichotomy of racially superior Germans and racially inferior Jews, central to Nazi ideology, could easily merge with the image of a beleaguered Germany, surrounded by warring enemies. If it is doubtful that most of the policemen understood or embraced the theoretical aspects of Nazi ideology as contained in SS indoctrination pamphlets, it is also doubtful that they were immune to the influence of the times, to use Lieutenant Drucker's phrase once again, to the incessant proclamation of German superiority, and instrument of contempt and hatred for the Jewish enemy. Nothing helped the Nazis to wage a race war so much as the war itself. In wartime, when it was all too usual to exclude the enemy from the community of human obligation, it was also all too easy to subsume the Jews into the image of the enemy or Feindbild. In his last book, The Drowned and the Saved, Primo Levi included an essay entitled The Gray Zone, perhaps his most profound and deeply disturbing reflection on the Holocaust. 50. He maintained that in spite of our natural desire for clear-cut distinctions, the history of the camps could not be reduced to the two blocks of victims and persecutors. He argued passionately, it is naive, absurd, and historically false to believe that an L system such as National Socialism sanctifies its victims. The contrary, it degrades them, it makes them resemble. The time had come to examine the inhabitants of the zone, between the simplified Manichean images of perpar and victim. Levi concentrated on the gray zone of exile left bracket corruption right bracket and collaboration that flourished in the PS among a spectrum of victims. From the picturesque of low-ranking functionaries, husbanding their minuscule tages over other prisoners, through the truly privileged orc of capos, who were free to commit the worst atrocities, to the terrible fate of the Sonderkommandos who owned their lives by manning the gas chambers, and Crema / conceiving and organizing the Sonderkommandos, was in S' opinion National Socialism's most demonic crime. T. Levi focused on the spectrum of victim behavior within Gray Zone. He dared to suggest that this zone encompassed iterators as well. Even the SS man Moosfeld, of the Birkenau, whose daily ration of slaughter was studded with and capricious acts marked by his inventions of ity, was not a monolith. Faced with the miraculous val of a 16-year-old girl, discovered while the gas cybers were being cleared, the disconcerted Moosfeld briefly tated. In the end he ordered the girl's death, but quickly lefty, his orders were carried out. One instant of pity was not to absolve Moosfeld, who was deservedly hanged, and yet it did place him too, although at its extreme dairy, within the grey band, that zone of ambiguity which carried us out from regimes based on terror and obsequiousness. The notion of the grey zone, encompassing both perpetrators' victims, must be approached with a cautious qualification. Perpetrators and victims in the grey zone were not mirrors of one another. Perpetrators did not become fellow is as many of them later claimed to be, in the way some is became accomplices of the perpetrators. The relationship in perpetrator and victim was not symmetrical. The range each faced was totally different. Nonetheless, the spectrum of Levi's gray zone seems quite applicable to Reserve Police Battalion 101. The battalion certainly had its quota of men who neared the extreme boundary of the gray zone. Lieutenant Nade, who initially rushed his men back from Minsk to avoid being involved in killing but who later learned to enjoy it, leaps to mind. So do the many reserve policemen who were horrified in the woods outside J6ZEF 6W but subsequently became casual volunteers for numerous firing squads and Jew hunts. They, like Moosfeld, seem to have experienced that brief instant of pity but cannot be absolved by it. At the other boundary of the gray zone, even Lieutenant Buckman, the most conspicuous and outspoken critic of the battalion's murderous actions, faltered at least once. Absent his protector, Major Trapp, and facing orders from the local security police in LUK 6W, he too led his men to the killing field shortly before his transfer back to Hamburg. And at the very center of the perpetrator's gray zone stood the pathetic figure of Trapp himself, who sent his men to slaughter Jews weeping like a child, and the bedridden Captain Hoffman, whose body rebelled against the terrible deeds his mind willed. The behavior of any human being is, of course, a very complex phenomenon, and the historian who attempts to explain it is indulging in a certain arrogance. When nearly 500 men are involved, to undertake any general explanation of their collective behavior is even more hazardous. What then is one to conclude? Most of all, one comes away from the story of Reserve Police Battalion 101 with great unease. This story of ordinary men is not the story of all men. The reserve policemen faced choices, and most of them committed terrible deeds. But those who killed cannot be absolved by the notion that anyone in the same situation would have done as they did. For even among them, some refused to kill and others stopped killing. Human responsibility is ultimately an individual matter. At the same time, however, the collective behavior of Reserve Police Battalion 101 has deeply disturbing implications. There are many societies afflicted by traditions of racism and caught in siege mentality of war or threat of war. Everywhere society shuns people to respect and defer to authority, and indeed do scarcely unction otherwise. Everywhere people seek our advancement. In every modern society, the complexity of and the resulting bureaucratization and specialization in the sense of personal responsibility of those implementing all policy. Within virtually every social collective, the PRP exerts tremendous pressures on behavior and sets moral S. If the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 could become MERS under such circumstances, what group of men cannot? Afterwards, Ordinary Men first appeared 6 years ago. It has been endlessly scrutinized and criticized by another author, Daniel A. Goldhagen, who not only wrote on the same topic, The Fashion of the Ordinary Germans, who became Holocaust perpetrators, but also chose to develop his own work, in part by arching the same documents concerning the same unit of Holocaust killers, namely the post-war judicial interrogations of members of Reserve Police Battalion 1011. It is not unusual for different scholars to ask different questions of apply different methodologies to and derive different interpretations the same sources. But the differences are seldom so stridently and cast in such an adversarial framework, as in this case, seldom in academic controversies, has the work of one of the adversaries become both an international bestseller, and the sub of countless reviews, ranging from the euphorically positive to wholly negative. To Professor Goldhagen, so critical of my work, has 191 become a target in turn. In short, Goldhagen's critique of this book and the subsequent controversy surrounding his own work merit a retrospective afterward in subsequent editions of Ordinary Men. On several issues Goldhagen and I do not disagree. First, the participation of numerous ordinary Germans in the mass murder of Jews, and second, the high degree of voluntarism they exhibited. The bulk of the killers were not specially selected, but drawn at random from a cross-section of German society, and they did not kill because they were coerced by the threat of dire punishment for refusing. However, neither of these conclusions is a new discovery in the field of Holocaust studies. It was one of the fundamental conclusions of Raoul Hilberg's magisterial and path-breaking study, The Destruction of the European Jews, which first appeared in 1961, that the perpetrators were not different in their moral makeup from the rest of the population. The German perpetrator was not a special kind of German. The perpetrators represented a remarkable cross-section of the German population, and the machinery of destruction was structurally no different from organized German society as a whole. 3. And it was the German scholar Herbert Jaeger 4, and the German prosecutors of the 1960s who firmly established that no one could document a single case in which Germans, who refused to carry out the killing of unarmed civilians, suffered dire consequences. Goldhagen does credit Jaeger and the German prosecutors in this regard, but he is utterly dismissive of Hilberg. Aside from the differences in the tone that we employ in writing about the Holocaust, and in the attitude that we display toward other scholars who have worked in this field of study, Goldhagen and I disagree significantly in two major areas of historical interpretation. The first is our different assessments of the role of anti-Semitism in German history, including the National Socialist era. The second is our different assessments of the motivations of the ordinary German men who became Holocaust killers. These are the two topics that I would like to discuss at some length. In his book Hitler's Willing Executioners, Daniel Goldhagen asserts that anti-Semitism more or less governed the ideational life. Civil society in pre-Nazi Germany 5 and when the Germans elected Hitler to power, the centrality of anti-Semitism in the S worldview, program, and rhetoric mirrored the sentiencies of German culture. 6 Because Hitler and the Germans were one mind about the Jews, he had merely to unshackle or ease their pre-existing, pent-up anti-Semitism to perpetrate Holocaust. 7 To buttress his view that the Nazi regime should be seen merely allowing or encouraging Germans to do what they wanted to do along, and not basically shaping German attitudes and behavior. 1933, Goldhagen formulates a thesis that he proclaims is to the study of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism does not disappear then reappear in a given society. Always present, anti-Semitism becomes more or less manifest. Not anti-Semitism if, but merely its expression, either increases or decreases, relating to changing conditions. 8c. Then in Goldhagen's account, this picture of underlying permanency and superficial fluctuation changes abruptly after 1945. The pervasive and permanent eliminationist German anti-Semitism was the sole and sufficient motivation of the Holocaust killers denly disappeared. Given rejection, a change in public condition, a law banning anti-Semitic expression, and the lack of institutional reinforcement, a German culture dominated by anti-Semitism for centuries was suddenly transformed. 9 Now we are the Germans are just like us. That anti-Semitism was a very significant aspect of Germany's political culture before 1945 and that Germany's political culture is profoundly different and dramatically less anti-Semitic today, two propositions that I can easily support. But if Germany's political culture, in general and anti-Semitism, in particular could be formed, after 1945 by changes, in education, public conversal law, and institutional reinforcements, as Goldhagen suggests, and it seems to me, equally plausible that they could have been wholly transformed, in the 3 or 4 decades, preceding 1945. Especially during the 12 years of Nazi rule. In his introductory chapter, Goldhagen provides a useful model for a three-dimensional analysis of anti-Semitism, even if he do not employ his own model in the subsequent chapters. Anti-Semitism, he argues, varies according to the alleged source or cause, for example, race, religion, culture, or environment of Jews' alleged negative character. It varies in degree of preoccupation, or priority, or how important is anti-Semitism to the anti-Semite. And it varies in degree of threat or how endangered anti-Semite feels. 10 That anti-Semitism can vary in its diagnosis of the alleged Jewish threat and along continuums of priority and less than intensity would suggest not only that anti-Semitism changes of time, as any or all of these dimensions change, but that it can exist in infinite variety. Even for a single country, like Germany, I think less than should speak and think in the plural of anti-Semitisms, rather anti-Semitism. The actual concept Goldhagen employs, however, produces the opposite effect. It erases all differentiation and subsumes all manifestations of anti-Semitism in Germany under a single rubric. All Germans, who perceived Jews as different and viewed this difference as something negative that should disappear through conversion, assimilation, emigration, or extermination, are classed as eliminationist anti-Semites, even if by Goldhagen's prior model, they differ as to cause priority and intensity. Such differences that do exist are analytically insignificant in any case, for, according to Goldhagen, variations on eliminationist solutions tend to metastasize into extermination. 11. By using such an approach, Goldhagen moves seamlessly from a variety of anti-Semitic manifestations in Germany to a single German eliminationist anti-Semitism that, taking on the properties of organic malignancy, naturally metastasized into extermination. Thus all Germany was of one mind, with Hitler on the justice and necessity of the final solution. If one adopts the analytical model that Goldhagen proposes rather than the concept he actually uses, what then can one say about the changing variety of anti-Semitisms in German political culture and their role in the Holocaust, and where to begin? Let us begin with 19th century German history, or more Sully, with various interpretations of Germany's alleged special or Sonderweg. According to the traditional social/structural Roche, Germany's failed liberal revolution of 1848 derailed ulterior political and economic modernization. Thereafter pre-capitalist German elites maintained their privileges in an erratic political system, while the unnerved middle classes were off with the prosperity of rapid economic modernization, fied by a national unification they had been unable to achieve of their own revolutionary efforts, and ultimately manipulated by an escalating social imperialism. 12. According to the ideological approach, the distorted and incomplete embrace the Enlightenment by some German intellectuals, followed by despair over an increasingly endangered and dissolving tradial world, led to a continuing rejection of liberal democratic val and traditions on the one hand, and a selective reconciliation aspects of modernity such as modern technology and ends is rationality, on the other, producing what Jeffrey Herf led a peculiarly German reactionary modernism. 13. A third Roche, exemplified by John Weiss and Daniel Goldhagen, RTS a German Sonderweg, in terms of the singular breadth and essence of anti-Semitism in Germany, though the former paints a less broad brush than the latter, and is careful to identify the 19th century loci of this German anti-Semitism in pop political movements, and among the political and academic. 14. Seems to me that Shulamit Volkov's interpretation of late 18th century German anti-Semitism as a cultural code constitutes an admirable synthesis of major elements of these though not totally mutually exclusive, notions of a German Zerwig. 15. German conservatives dominating an illiberal polity system, but feeling their leading role increasingly imperiled by changes unleashed by modernization, associated anti-Semitism everything. They felt threatened by liberalism, democracyism, internationalism, capitalism, and cultural experimented to be a self-proclaimed anti-Semite was also to be authoritarian, nationalist, imperialist, protectionist, corporative and culture. Ally traditional. Volkov concludes anti-Semitism was, by the right bracket, strongly associated with everything the conservatives stood for. I became increasingly inseparable from their anti-modernism. But insofar as the conservatives co-opted the anti-Semitic issue from populist, single-issue anti-Semitic political parties and enlisted pseudo-scientific and social Darwinist racial thinking in its support, the conservatives were embracing an issue in defense or reaction that had a peculiarly modern cast to it, not unlike less than simultaneous embrace of naval building. By the turn of the century, a German anti-Semitism increasingly racial in nature had become an integral part of the conservative political platform, and penetrated deeply into the universities. I had become more politicized and institutionalized than in the Western democracies of France, Britain, and the United States. But that does not mean that late 19th century German anti-Semitism dominated either politics or ideational life. The conservatives and single-issue, anti-Semitic parties together constituted a minority, while majorities could be found in the Prussian Landtag to pass discriminatory legislation against Catholics in the 1870s and in the Reichstag against socialists in the 1880s. The emancipation of Germany's Jews, who constituted less than 1% of the population, and were scarcely capable of defending themselves against a Germany united in hostile obsession against them, was not revoked. If the left did not exhibit a philo-Semitism comparable to the right's anti-Semitism, it was primarily because for the left anti-Semitism was a non-issue that did not fit into its own class analysis, not because of its own anti-Semitism. Even for the openly anti-Semitic conservatives, the Jewish issue was but one among many. And to suggest that they felt more threatened by the Jews than, for example, by the triple entente abroad or social democracy at home would be a serious distortion. If anti-Semitism was neither the priority issue nor the greatest threat even for conservatives, how much less was this the case for the rest of German society? As Richard Levy has noted, one can make a convincing case that left bracket Jews right bracket were of very little interest to most Germans most of the time, putting them at the center of German history in 19th and 20th centuries is a highly unproductive 16 for some Germans. Of course, Jews were the top priority and of greatest fear. The turn of the century anti-Semitism of conservatives fits well Gavin Langmuir's notion of xenophobic anti-Semitism, a negative stereotype comprised of various versions that did not describe the real Jewish minority but rather symbolized various threats and menaces that anti-Semites could and did not want to understand. 17 Langmuir notes as well that phobic anti-Semitism provides the fertile soil for the growth fantastic or chimeric anti-Semitism, or what Saul Friedlander recently dubbed redemptive anti-Semitism. 18 If Germany's phobic anti-Semitism was an important piece of the political form of an important segment of the political spectrum, the emptive anti-Semites with their chimeric accusations from ish poisoning of Aryan blood to a secret Jewish world conspire behind the twin threats of Marxist revolution and plutocratic autocracy were still a fringe phenomenon. The succession of traumatic experiences in Germany between 12 and 1929, loss of control of the Reichstag by the right, melee defeat revolution, runaway inflation, and economic collapse formed German politics. The right grew at the expense of the and within the former the radicals, or new right, grew at expense of the traditionalists, or old right. Chimeric anti-itism grew commensurately from a fringe phenomenon to the idea of a movement that became Germany's largest political in the summer of 1932 and its ruling party 6 months later. That fact alone makes the history of Germany and German anti-Semitism different from that of any other country in Europe. And this must be kept in perspective. The Nazis never gained than 37% of the vote in a free election, less than the Bind socialist communist vote. Daniel Goldhagen is right to remind us that individuals' attitudes on single issues cannot be aired from their votes. 19 But it is highly unlikely that he is core in his related assertion that large numbers of Germans who for the Social Democratic Party for economic reasons were nonetheless of one mind with Hitler and the Nazis about Jews. While I cannot prove it, I strongly suspect far more Germans voted Nazi for reasons other than anti-Semitism than Germans who considered anti-Semitism a priority issue, but nonetheless voted for a party other than the Nazis. Neither the election returns, nor any plausible spin put on them suggest that in 1932, the vast majority of Germans were of one mind with Hitler about the Jews, or that the centrality of anti-Semitism in the party's worldview, program, and rhetoric mirrored the sentiments of German culture. 20 Beginning in 1933, all the factors that Goldhagen credits with dismantling German anti-Semitism after 1945 education, public conversation law, and institutional reinforcement were operating in the opposite direction to intensify anti-Semitism among the Germans, and indeed in a far more concerted manner than in the post-war period. Can one seriously doubt that this had significant impact, particularly given the rising popularity of Hitler and the regime for its economic and foreign policy successes? As William Sheridan Allen succinctly concluded, even in a highly Nazified town like Northeim, most people were drawn to anti-Semitism because they were drawn to Nazism, not the other way around. 21. Moreover, the 1936 so-called underground report to which Goldhagen repeatedly refers anti-Semitism has no doubt taken root in wide circles of the population. The general anti-Semitic psychosis affects even thoughtful people, our comrades as well. 22 is evidence of change in German attitudes following the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, not the prior situation. Even in the post-1933 period, however, it is best to speak in the plural of German anti-Semitisms. Within the party, there was indeed a large core of Germans, for whom the Jews were a dire racial threat and central priority. The hardcore chimeric, or redemptive, anti-Semites of the Nazi movement differed in style and preferred response, however. At one end of the spectrum were the saw and striker types lusting for pogroms. At the other end were the cool and calculating, intellectual anti-Semites described by Ulrich Herbert in his new biography of Werner Best, who advocated a more systematic but dispassionate persecution. 23. Hitler's conservative allies favored demancipation and segregation of the Jews as part of the counter-revolution and movement of national renewal. They strove to end the allegedly inordinate SH influence on German life, though this was scarcely a priority to dismantling the labor unions, Marxist parties, and parliamentary democracy, or to rearmament and the restoration of Germany's great power status. They often spoke the language of racial anti-Semitism.